The air in the bayou is thick with the stench of decay, a suffocating blend of rotting vegetation and stagnant water that clings to the skin like a cold, wet shroud. As the sun dips below the horizon, the shadows lengthen, and the swamp comes alive with the eerie sounds of unseen creatures. It is a place where the line between the living and the dead blurs, where the whispers of the damned can be heard and the rustling of the cypress trees. In the heart of this forsaken wilderness lies a dark secret, a tale whispered only in hushed tones by those brave enough to venture near. It is the story of the Swamp Witch, a malevolent spirit said to haunt the murky waters, her wrathful presence felt by all who dare disturb her eternal rest. But there is another more terrifying figure that stalks these swamps, the Southern Cannibal, a twisted soul whose hunger knows no bounds. Together, these two legends have woven a tapestry of horror that has ensnared the souls of many who have crossed their path. Tonight, you will be taken deep into the heart of their dark domain, where the truth behind these nightmarish figures will be revealed. But be warned, once you enter the world of the Swamp Witch and the Southern Cannibal, you may never escape. The old wooden sign creaked as it swung lazily in the humid breeze. "Welcome to Blackwood Bayou," it read, though the letters were nearly worn away by time and neglect. Lydia stared at it from behind the wheel of her car, her stomach twisting with a mix of curiosity and dread. The stories she had heard as a child, the ones about the Swamp Witch and the Southern Cannibal, had drawn her back here, to the place where her nightmares had begun. The swamp had a way of calling people back, especially those with ties to its dark past. As Lydia drove deeper into the bayou, the road turned to dirt, then to a narrow path barely wide enough for her car. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like ghostly veils, and the water on either side of the road was dark and still. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. It was as if the swamp itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a wrong move. She finally reached the end of the path and stepped out of the car, the air thick with moisture and the scent of decay. The cabin she had inherited from her grandmother stood before her, its windows dark and its wooden walls warped with age. Lydia shivered as she approached the door, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. She had come here to find answers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and mildew filled her nostrils. The cabin was small, just one room with a sagging bed in the corner and a rickety table near the window. The only light came from the setting sun filtering through the grimy glass. Lydia set her bag down on the table and looked around, her eyes lingering on the old diary lying on the bed. It was the reason she had come, the last piece of her grandmother's legacy and perhaps the key to understanding the dark history of the swamp. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, the diary resting in her lap. Its cover was cracked and faded, the leather soft from years of handling. She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding in her chest. The stories her grandmother had told her as a child were terrifying, but they had always been just that, stories. Now, as she prepared to read the words her grandmother had written, those stories felt all too real. The first page was dated over 50 years ago, the ink smudged but still legible. As Lydia began to read, the words seemed to come alive, drawing her into the past. Her grandmother had written about the strange occurrences that had plagued the swamp, the eerie lights that flickered through the trees at night, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. But the most chilling entries were about the Swamp Witch, a malevolent spirit that was said to haunt the bayou. According to the diary, the Swamp Witch had been a real woman once, a healer who lived on the edge of the swamp. She had been blamed for a series of mysterious deaths in the nearby town, accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. But her spirit had not gone quietly. It was said that she cursed the town with her dying breath, vowing to take revenge on those who had wronged her. And so, the Swamp Witch became a legend. Her spirit was said to haunt the swamp, luring the unwary to their doom. Lydia shuddered as she read the last entry. It spoke of the Southern Cannibal, a man who had once lived in the swamp and had been driven mad by the witch's curse. He had turned to cannibalism, hunting those who ventured into the bayou. The townsfolk had eventually caught him, but not before he had killed and eaten several people. His ghost was said to still haunt the swamp, forever searching for his next meal. As Lydia closed the diary, the room seemed to grow colder. She could almost hear the whispers her grandmother had written about, a low murmur that sent chills down her spine. She stood up and crossed the room to the window, peering out into the darkness. The swamp was silent. The only sound was the occasional croak of a frog or the rustle of the wind through the trees. But Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching her. Night had fallen over Blackwood Bayou, and the cabin was enveloped in darkness. Lydia lit a candle, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her since she had read her grandmother's diary. The stories of the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal had always been terrifying, but now they felt like more than just legends. They felt like a warning. Lydia sat at the table, the diary open before her. She had read it cover to cover, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Why had her grandmother written about these things? And why had she kept it all a secret until now? As Lydia pondered these questions, a sudden noise outside made her jump. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves or the creak of a tree branch. But in the stillness of the night, it sounded ominous. She stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The candlelight barely reached the edge of the clearing, leaving the rest of the swamp shrouded in shadow. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she thought she saw something move in the distance, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. She strained her eyes, but there was nothing there, only the stillness of the night. Telling herself it was just her imagination, Lydia turned away from the window and went back to the table. But the unease lingered, a gnawing fear that something was terribly wrong. She tried to distract herself by reading more of the diary, but the words blurred together and she couldn't focus. The cabin felt oppressive, the walls closing in on her, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. Finally, she gave up and decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would come quickly and bring some relief from the fear that gripped her. But as she lay down on the old creaking bed, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sounds of the swamp. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from all around her. Lydia pulled the covers up to her chin, her heart racing. She could almost make out words, though they were distorted and unintelligible, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. The fear that had been gnawing at her all day finally took hold, and she realized with a sinking feeling that the stories her grandmother had told were not just legends. They were real, and whatever haunted the swamp was now coming for her. The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the cabin, but it did little to chase away the lingering darkness in Lydia's mind. She had barely slept, her night filled with the whispers and shadows that seemed to close in around her. The unease she felt had only deepened with the dawn, a sense that the swamp itself was alive, aware of her presence. Lydia knew she had to learn more about the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal if she was to make sense of the diary's ominous entries. She decided to visit the small town nearby, hoping to find someone who could shed light on the legends that had haunted her family for generations. With the diary tucked safely in her bag, she left the cabin, locking the door behind her as if that would keep the darkness at bay. The town was, as she remembered it from her childhood, quiet, almost forgotten by time. The few people she saw on the streets seemed to avoid her gaze, their faces lined with the weariness of those who had lived too long under a shadow of fear. Lydia made her way to the general store, a relic from another era, where the smell of old wood and dust greeted her as she pushed open the door. Behind the counter stood Mr. Johnson, an elderly man with a face as weathered as the wood of the store itself. He had been there for as long as Lydia could remember, always with a kind word or a piece of candy for the local children. But today, his smile faded when he saw her, replaced by a look of concern. "Lydia," he said, his voice tinged with worry, "what brings you back to Blackwood?" She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm staying at the old cabin," she finally said, watching his reaction carefully. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened slightly, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You shouldn't be out there, not alone. That place, it's dangerous." Lydia nodded, her suspicion confirmed. "I've been reading my grandmother's diary. She wrote about the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal. Do you know anything about them?" The old man sighed deeply, his gaze distant, as if recalling painful memories. "Those aren't just stories, Lydia. The swamp witch was real, and so was her curse. Your grandmother knew that better than anyone. She tried to protect you from it, but now, you've brought it all back." As Mr. Johnson spoke, Lydia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The weight of the curse seemed to hang in the air between them, a palpable force that had shaped the lives of everyone in the town. The old man's voice trembled slightly as he continued, his eyes fixed on a distant point as if seeing the events unfold before him once more. "They say the swamp witch was a healer, a woman of great knowledge who lived on the edge of the bayou. But the townsfolk didn't understand her, and when people started dying under mysterious circumstances, they blamed her. They dragged her from her home, accused her of witchcraft, and burned her alive. But before she died, she cursed them all. She swore that her spirit would never rest until she had taken her revenge." Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The story was eerily similar to what she had read in her grandmother's diary, but hearing it from Mr. Johnson made it all the more real. "And the Southern Cannibal?" she asked, dreading the answer. Mr. Johnson shook his head, his expression grave. "He was a man who lived deep in the swamp, far from the town. They say he was a kind man once, but the curse twisted him and drove him mad. He began hunting people, taking them back to his cabin, and, well, you can imagine the rest. They caught him eventually, but the swamp didn't let him go. His spirit is still out there, lost in the darkness, searching for his next victim." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Lydia felt the walls of the small store closing in on her, the oppressive weight of the swamp's dark history pressing down on her chest. She knew she should leave, forget about the diary and the cabin, but something stronger than fear kept her rooted in place. "What should I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson looked at her with a mix of pity and resolve. "There's nothing you can do, Lydia. The curse has been unleashed, and it won't stop until it's claimed what it wants. All you can do is try to survive." The drive back to the cabin felt like a journey into the heart of darkness. The sky had begun to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon, casting the swamp into an early twilight. Lydia's mind raced with the old man's words, each one a nail in the coffin of her growing terror. The curse was real, and it had been waiting for her, lurking in the shadows of her family's past, ready to claim her as its next victim. By the time she reached the cabin, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, tapping lightly on the roof like skeletal fingers. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her, as if that would somehow keep the curse at bay. The cabin felt different now, darker, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the fear and despair of generations. Lydia lit a fire in the old stone hearth, the flames casting a flickering light that did little to dispel the shadows. She pulled out the diary, her hands trembling as she opened it to the last few pages. Her grandmother had written about the curse's power, how it fed on fear, growing stronger with each victim it claimed. The last entry was particularly chilling. It spoke of a way to break the curse, but the words were smudged, as if her grandmother had been too frightened to finish writing them. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending a shiver down Lydia's spine. The rain had turned into a downpour, the sound of it drumming against the roof like a funeral march. She stared at the smudged words, trying to decipher their meaning, but it was no use. Whatever her grandmother had discovered, it was lost to time. As the night deepened, Lydia's sense of dread grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. The whispers had returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing hour. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, the voices of the damned echoing through the cabin. Lydia huddled by the fire, the diary clutched tightly in her hands. The fear was overwhelming, a cold, suffocating presence that seeped into her very soul. She knew she couldn't stay here, but where could she go? The curse was everywhere, in the very air she breathed, in the water that surrounded her. There was no escape. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, she heard it, a soft, wet thud against the door. Her blood ran cold as the sound repeated, a rhythmic, deliberate knock that echoed through the cabin. She didn't want to open the door, didn't want to see what was on the other side, but the knock persisted, growing louder, more insistent. With trembling hands, Lydia reached for the door, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She knew deep down that whatever was out there was no longer human. It was the curse come to claim her. The persistent knocking on the cabin door echoed through the cramped space, each thud a grim reminder of the curse that now held Lydia captive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, the diary still clutched tightly in her hands. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee into the safety of the swamp, but the oppressive darkness outside seemed to seal her fate within these decaying walls. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lydia took a tentative step toward the door. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the cold metal handle, her mind racing with memories of her grandmother's warnings. She had always dismissed the tales as mere folklore, but now faced with the tangible horror of the Southern Cannibal's revenge, she couldn't deny their truth. Taking a deep breath, Lydia slowly opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The night air rushed in, thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and decay. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but she could make out the dense foliage surrounding the cabin. Shadows danced menacingly among the trees, shifting and contorting as if alive. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His presence was unnerving, a manifestation of the very legends she had sought to uncover. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, but the man advanced, his movements unnaturally smooth. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo that sent chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her mind desperately searching for a way to escape. The Southern Cannibal stood before her, his eyes devoid of humanity, reflecting the darkness that had consumed him. He reached out a skeletal hand, and Lydia recoiled, her fear turning to sheer terror. Before she could react further, the man dissipated into a mist of shadows, leaving Lydia alone once more. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a final judgment. She sank to the floor, trembling uncontrollably, her mind reeling from the encounter. As Lydia struggled to regain her composure, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They swirled around her, a cacophony of anguished voices that seemed to seep from the very walls. She could barely make out fragments of sentences, but the underlying message was clear. The curse was far from over, and her presence had only intensified its wrath. Determined to find a way to survive, Lydia forced herself to rise, her resolve hardening despite the fear that threatened to consume her. She knew that understanding the curse was her only chance to break free from its relentless grip. With the diary as her guide, she vowed to uncover the secrets that had ensnared her family and the town, no matter the cost. Determined to unravel the mysteries that had trapped her in this nightmare, Lydia began to meticulously comb through her grandmother's diary. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, sketches of the swamp, and fragmented memories that hinted at a deeper, more sinister truth. Among the entries, one phrase stood out: "The heart of the swamp holds the key." Interpreting this as a clue, Lydia decided to explore the swamp in search of answers. She knew the dangers that lurked within, the tales of disappearances, the malevolent spirits, and the ever-present threat of the Southern Cannibal. But her desperation outweighed her fear. She had to find a way to end the curse that had plagued her family for generations. Gathering her courage, Lydia packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a map of the bayou, the diary, and a sturdy knife her grandmother had kept for protection. She knew venturing into the swamp alone was perilous, but she had no other choice. As dusk approached, she stepped out into the fading light, the dense foliage swallowing her silhouette as she made her way toward the heart of the swamp. The path was treacherous, the ground soft and treacherous beneath her boots. Spanish moss draped from the towering cypress trees, creating an almost impenetrable canopy that blocked out the remaining light. Every sound seemed amplified: the croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Lydia pressed forward, her senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. Hours passed as she navigated the labyrinthine waterways, following the vague directions scribbled in the diary. The swamp seemed to resist her presence, paths shifting and changing as if to confound her. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, casting fleeting beams of light that barely pierced the darkness. Fatigue settled in, but Lydia pressed on, driven by the desperate hope of finding a solution. Just as her strength began to wane, she stumbled upon a clearing that matched one of her grandmother's sketches. A secluded pond surrounded by ancient trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. In the center of the pond stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and etched with strange symbols. It was a place of power, a focal point of the swamp's dark magic. Approaching the altar, Lydia felt a palpable energy in the air, a heavy presence that seemed to watch her every move. She set down her bag and carefully examined the symbols, recognizing them from the diary. They depicted a ritual of protection, a way to bind the spirits and break the curse. But the instructions were incomplete, the final steps missing from the faded pages. Determined to find the missing pieces, Lydia began searching the area, hoping to uncover any remnants of her grandmother's research. As she scoured the perimeter, a sudden noise made her freeze, a low, guttural growl emanating from the shadows. Her heart raced as she turned to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. The Southern Cannibal had found her. Panic surged through Lydia as the Southern Cannibal stepped into the clearing, his presence a terrifying reminder of the curse's reach. His hollow eyes fixed on her, and his twisted smile seemed to mock her futile attempts to escape the swamp's grip. She backed away, her mind racing for a way to defend herself, but the knife felt woefully inadequate against the supernatural horror before her. Desperate, Lydia remembered the symbols on the altar and the protective rituals her grandmother had mentioned. She reached into her bag and retrieved a small vial of salt, a protective talisman her grandmother had insisted was essential in warding off evil spirits. With trembling hands, she sprinkled the salt around the altar, creating a barrier that she hoped would buy her some time. The Southern Cannibal advanced, his movements unnervingly swift. As he neared the altar, Lydia began to recite the incantation she had pieced together from the diary's fragmented entries. Her voice wavered at first, but determination lent her strength as she continued the chant. The air around her seemed to shimmer, the oppressive darkness momentarily lifting as the ritual took effect. A brilliant light emanated from the altar, bathing the clearing in a radiant glow. The symbols glowed with an ethereal light, and the swamp around her seemed to hold its breath. The Southern Cannibal recoiled, his form flickering as if caught between worlds. Lydia pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word, channeling the protective magic her grandmother had taught her. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the light and plunging the area back into darkness. Lydia's heart sank as the Southern Cannibal regained his composure, his eyes burning with malevolent fury. He lunged at her, but before he could reach her, a spectral figure materialized beside her, the Swamp Witch herself. Her presence was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, her translucent form shimmering with an otherworldly light. The Swamp Witch raised her hands and a powerful force emanated from her, pushing the Southern Cannibal back. The two spirits faced each other, their eternal conflict playing out in the heart of the swamp. Lydia watched in awe as the two entities clashed, their powers intertwining in a display of supernatural might. Taking advantage of the distraction, Lydia seized the moment to complete the ritual. She chanted the final words with unwavering resolve, her voice merging with the echoes of the Swamp Witch's power. A surge of energy coursed through her, and she felt the curse begin to unravel, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits were bound by the ritual's magic. The Southern Cannibal let out a final, anguished howl as he was pulled back into the shadows, his form dissipating into the night. The Swamp Witch nodded solemnly before fading away, her mission of vengeance finally complete. The clearing was silent once more. The oppressive darkness lifted as dawn's first light began to pierce the canopy. Exhausted but triumphant, Lydia collapsed to the ground, the diary slipping from her grasp. She had done it. She had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious. The curse was broken, and the spirits that had tormented the swamp for generations were finally at peace. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the clearing, Lydia felt a sense of relief and closure wash over her. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger, ready to embrace the future free from the shadows of the past. The dawn had broken over the swamp, casting an eerie, golden light over the murky waters and gnarled trees. Lydia remained seated on the damp ground, her body aching from the encounter with the Southern Cannibal and the Swamp Witch. The ritual had taken its toll, leaving her drained but resolute. She knew the curse was not entirely broken. There were still secrets buried deep within the swamp that she had yet to uncover. Lydia picked up the diary, its pages now more precious to her than ever. The last entry she had deciphered had led her to the heart of the swamp, but she sensed that there was more. Something her grandmother had been trying to protect, hidden in the cryptic notes and symbols. With renewed determination, she began to read the diary again, searching for clues that might lead her to the final piece of the puzzle. As she flipped through the pages, she came across a map, crudely drawn but recognizable as a part of the bayou she hadn't yet explored. The map led to a location marked only as the Black Pool, a place her grandmother had mentioned only in passing, a forbidden site that was said to hold the darkest of the swamp's secrets. Lydia's heart raced as she realized that this was where she needed to go, where the final confrontation would take place. She gathered her belongings and set out, the weight of her mission pressing down on her shoulders. The path to the Black Pool was treacherous, more so than any she had traversed before. The swamp seemed to sense her purpose, resisting her with every step. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very land itself sought to protect its darkest secret. The journey took hours, the sun climbing high into the sky before she finally arrived. The Black Pool was as forbidding as its name suggested, a still, black expanse of water, surrounded by towering cypress trees whose roots twisted into grotesque shapes. The surface of the water was so dark that it reflected nothing, a void that seemed to swallow the light. Lydia shivered as she approached, the sense of dread growing with every step. She knew instinctively that this was the epicenter of the curse, the place where the Swamp Witch's dark magic had been born. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, a malevolence that seemed to reach out and grasp at her very soul. Lydia hesitated, but she knew she had no choice. If she was to end the curse once and for all, she had to confront whatever lay beneath the surface of the Black Pool. Standing at the edge of the Black Pool, Lydia felt the weight of generations of suffering and fear pressing down on her. The swamp was silent, the usual sounds of wildlife absent, as if the very earth was holding its breath. She knelt beside the water, her reflection distorted and wavering in the dark surface. The diary's map had led her here, but it offered no guidance on what she was supposed to do next. Lydia carefully examined the area around the pool, her eyes scanning for any sign of what her grandmother had hidden here. As she searched, she noticed something strange. Markings on the ground, almost imperceptible, but clearly man-made. She followed the markings, which formed a circle around the pool, symbols carved into the earth that matched those in the diary. They were protection symbols, but they had been broken, their power disrupted long ago. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened here. It was clear that someone, likely her grandmother, had attempted to contain the evil within the Black Pool. But the barrier had been shattered, releasing the dark force that had plagued the swamp ever since. Lydia realized with a sinking heart that the Southern Cannibal and the Swamp Witch were merely manifestations of this greater evil, twisted by its influence. With trembling hands, she retrieved the diary and began to chant the incantations written within, hoping to restore the broken protection. The words felt heavy on her tongue, laden with the power of generations of witches who had fought to keep this darkness at bay. As she chanted, the symbols on the ground began to glow faintly, their power slowly returning. But something was wrong. The air grew colder, the wind picking up and howling through the trees like a chorus of tormented souls. The water in the Black Pool began to ripple, despite the lack of any physical disturbance. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that she had awakened something that had been waiting, lurking beneath the surface, eager to be released. Without warning, the water erupted, a massive column of black liquid shooting into the air. Lydia stumbled back, shielding her face from the spray, as a figure emerged from the depths. A twisted, nightmarish form, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. It was the source of the curse, the true evil that had corrupted the swamp and claimed so many lives. The creature loomed over Lydia, its presence overwhelming, a dark force that seemed to suck the very light from the world around it. She could feel its power, a suffocating energy that threatened to crush her. But she knew she couldn't falter, not now. With every ounce of strength she had left, she raised the diary and continued the incantation, her voice rising above the howling wind. The dark figure towered over Lydia, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of pure shadow. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, bore into hers, filling her with a terror unlike anything she had ever felt before. The black pool's waters churned violently, as if the earth itself was rejecting the abomination that had emerged from its depths. Lydia's mind screamed at her to flee, to run as fast as she could and never look back, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, the weight of the darkness bearing down on her like a physical force. The creature took a step closer, its presence causing the very air to tremble, and Lydia knew that she was standing on the edge of oblivion. But even in the face of such overwhelming horror, something deep within her refused to give in. The legacy of her grandmother and the strength of the witches who had come before her all flowed through her veins, lending her the courage she needed to face the darkness. Lydia gripped the diary tightly, her knuckles white, and continued to chant the incantation, her voice rising in defiance. The creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering as the power of the ancient words took hold. Lydia could see the symbols on the ground glowing brighter, their protective magic slowly reawakening. But the dark force was strong, its will bending reality itself as it fought to break free from the bonds that had held it for so long. Lydia's vision blurred the strain of the ritual and the sheer malevolence of the creature taking their toll on her. She felt her strength waning, the power slipping from her grasp. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. With a final, desperate surge of energy, she poured everything she had into the incantation, the words flowing from her lips like a river of light. The ground beneath her trembled, and the air was filled with a deafening roar as the creature thrashed in fury. The protective symbols blazed with a brilliant light, their power binding the dark force, pulling it back into the abyss from which it had come. Lydia's vision darkened as the energy was drained from her, but she could feel the tide turning. The creature's power was waning, its form dissolving into the shadows from which it had been born. With a final ear-splitting scream, the dark force was pulled back into the black pool, the waters closing over it like a shroud. The wind died down, the swamp fell into a sudden, eerie silence. Lydia collapsed to the ground, the diary slipping from her grasp as she fought to stay conscious. The darkness that had plagued the swamp for so long was gone, sealed away once more by the ancient magic of her ancestors. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, Lydia knew she had done it. The curse was finally broken, the evil that had haunted her family in the swamp defeated. But the victory had come at a great cost, and she could feel the toll it had taken on her soul. She lay there exhausted but at peace, knowing that she had fulfilled her grandmother's legacy and freed the swamp from its dark past. Lydia remained beside the black pool, her body aching from the exertion and the confrontation with the dark force. The swamp was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath in the aftermath of the battle. The oppressive weight that had hung over the land for generations seemed to have lifted, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. But Lydia knew better than to let her guard down. The curse may have been weakened, but something still lingered, a final echo of the darkness that had yet to be silenced. As she slowly regained her strength, Lydia reflected on the events that had brought her here. The diary, the swamp witch, the Southern Cannibal, everything had led to this moment. Her grandmother's warnings, the stories she had dismissed as mere folklore, had all been real. And now Lydia had become a part of that story, her actions intertwined with the fate of the swamp. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and gathered her belongings. The black pool was calm now, its surface still and reflective, but Lydia could feel the residual energy that clung to the air like a mist. The ritual had succeeded, but the swamp's dark history couldn't be erased easily. There was still one more thing she had to do. Lydia knew she couldn't leave the swamp without ensuring the evil would never return. The protective symbols had been restored, but the dark force had been more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. It had taken every ounce of her strength to contain it, and she wasn't sure if the binding would hold forever. As she made her way back to the cabin, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the bayou. The swamp seemed to watch her, the trees and the water whispering secrets that only they could understand. Lydia's heart was heavy with the knowledge that her family's curse might never truly be broken, but she had come this far, and she wasn't going to turn back now. When she reached the cabin, the sun was almost gone, and the swamp was bathed in the dim light of dusk. Lydia entered the small familiar space, the smell of old wood and mildew greeting her like an old friend. She set the diary on the table, its pages now filled with the final chapter of her family's story. But she wasn't done yet. There was one last entry she needed to make. Lydia lit the fire on the hearth, the flames flickering to life and casting dancing shadows across the walls. The warmth was welcome, but it did little to ease the cold that had settled deep within her bones. She knew what had to be done, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. The diary lay open before her, the pages filled with the memories and warnings of those who had come before her. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, guiding her as she prepared for the final ritual. She took a deep breath and began to write, her pen scratching across the aged paper. The words flowed easily as if they had been waiting all along to be released. She wrote of the curse, the battles fought, and the sacrifices made to keep the darkness at bay. She wrote of the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal, of the spirits that haunted the bayou, and of the dark force that had threatened to consume them all. And finally, she wrote of the ritual that had bound the evil once more, sealing it away for future generations to guard against. When she finished, Lydia set the pen down and stared at the final entry. It was a warning, a plea to whoever might find the diary in the future. The curse was contained but not destroyed. The swamp was still a place of dark power, and it would take vigilance and strength to keep the darkness from rising again. She knew she couldn't stay here. The swamp had claimed enough lives, and she wasn't willing to be the next victim. But before she left, there was one final act she had to perform. Lydia gathered the materials she needed, a mixture of salt, herbs, and other items her grandmother had taught her to use in rituals. She sprinkled the mixture around the cabin, chanting softly as she did so, her voice steady and sure. The ritual was one of protection, a final safeguard to keep the cabin safe from the darkness that lurked in the swamp. The words of the chant flowed from her lips, each one infused with the power of her ancestors. As she finished, the air seemed to hum with energy, the protection taking hold. Lydia felt a sense of peace settles over the cabin, a reassurance that evil would not breach these walls again. But as she stepped back from the circle, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a shiver down her spine. The swamp was restless as if it knew what she had done. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the final confrontation was far from over. Night had fallen over the bayou, the darkness deep and impenetrable. Lydia stood in the center of the cabin, the flickering fire the only source of light. The wind howled outside, a mournful wail that seemed to carry the voices of the lost souls trapped in the swamp. She could feel the presence of the dark force, its energy swirling around the cabin like a storm, searching for a way in. The protection she had placed held strong, but Lydia knew it wouldn't last forever. The dark force was relentless, its power ancient and malevolent. It had been weakened, but not destroyed, and now it sought revenge. Lydia's heart raced as she realized that she was the last line of defense, the only thing standing between the swamp and the return of the darkness. Suddenly, the fire flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The temperature dropped, and Lydia could see her breath in the air. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't prepared for the sheer force of the assault. The windows shattered inward, the door rattled on its hinges, and the walls groaned as if under immense pressure. The dark force was trying to break through, to consume her as it had so many others. Lydia's mind raced, searching for a solution. The ritual had bound the darkness, but it was clear that the dark force was too powerful to be contained for long. She had to find a way to banish it once and for all, to rid the swamp of its curse forever. But how? In the chaos, a memory surfaced, a story her grandmother had told her long ago, about a ritual that could destroy even the most powerful of spirits. It was dangerous and it required a great sacrifice, but it was the only way. Lydia knew what she had to do, even if it meant giving up everything. With trembling hands, she reached for the diary, flipping through the pages to find the incantation she needed. The words were difficult to decipher, written in an ancient script that her grandmother had taught her only in fragments. But Lydia's determination fueled her, and she began to chant, her voice rising above the howling wind and the cracking walls. The air around her shimmered with energy, the protective circle glowing brighter as the dark force battered against it. Lydia continued the chant, pouring her soul into the words, drawing on the strength of her ancestors. The darkness outside the cabin roared in fury, but it couldn't break through. Not yet. As Lydia neared the end of the incantation, she knew what she had to do. The final words of the ritual required a sacrifice, her own life, given willingly to seal the darkness away forever. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her, but she didn't waver. She had come this far, and she couldn't let the darkness win. With a final, resolute breath, Lydia spoke the last words of the incantation. The cabin shook violently, the air crackling with energy. The dark force let out a deafening scream, a sound that reverberated through the swamp, shaking the very earth. Lydia felt a surge of power course through her, the protective magic of the ritual taking hold. And then, in an instant, it was over. The dark force was gone, banished back to the void from which it had come. The cabin was silent once more. The oppressive energy lifted, and the curse was finally broken. Lydia collapsed to the floor, her body drained of all strength, but her heart filled with peace. She had done it. The swamp was free. As the first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows, Lydia closed her eyes, a smile on her lips. She had fulfilled her grandmother's legacy and saved her family and the swamp from the darkness that had plagued them for so long. The final night had ended, and with it, the curse that had haunted the bayou for generations. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the shattered windows of the cabin, casting a soft, golden light over the scene. Lydia lay on the floor, her body still, but her expression peaceful. The weight of the curse, the darkness that had haunted the swamp for generations, had finally been lifted. The air was clear, free from the oppressive energy that had once clung to every tree and blade of grass. The swamp outside was silent, as if in reverence for the sacrifice that had been made. The wind had stilled, the water in the bayou calm and reflective, mirroring the peace that had settled over the land. Birds began to chirp hesitantly, their songs the first sounds of life to break the quiet dawn. Lydia had known the risks and had understood that the final ritual might claim her life. But she had faced the darkness with courage, driven by a determination to end the suffering that had plagued her family and the people of the bayou. Her sacrifice was the key to breaking the curse. And now, in the light of the new day, it was clear that she had succeeded. The diary lay beside her, open to the final page where she had recorded the last of her grandmother's warnings. The ink had barely dried, the words a testament to the battle that had been fought and won. But the diary, like Lydia, was now at rest. Its pages, once filled with tales of horror and warnings, were now part of a history that would no longer repeat itself. As the sun rose higher, its light spread across the swamp, dispelling the last vestiges of darkness. The black pool, once a source of malevolence and fear, was now still and quiet, its power sealed away forever. The swamp was returning to what it had once been, a place of natural beauty, where life could flourish without the shadow of the curse. In the nearby town, the people stirred from their slumber, unaware of the events that had unfolded in the swamp. The fear that had gripped their hearts for so long had eased, though they couldn't yet explain why. The air seemed lighter, the sun warmer, as if a great burden had been lifted from the land. As the townsfolk went about their morning routines, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The whispers of the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal were no longer spoken of with fear. Instead, there was a sense of relief, as if a long nightmare had finally ended. The oppressive silence that had settled over the town for generations had given way to a cautious optimism. Mr. Johnson, the elderly shopkeeper, stepped outside his store and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. He could feel it. Something had changed. The unease that had always gnawed at the back of his mind was gone, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what had happened, but he suspected that Lydia had something to do with it. The people of the town began to gather in the square, exchanging glances of wonder and confusion. They didn't understand how or why, but they knew that the swamp and their lives had been changed forever. The curse that had hung over them like a dark cloud was gone, and in its place was the promise of a new beginning. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, a few of the braver souls ventured out to the edge of the swamp, curious to see what had changed. They found the bayou quiet and serene, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers instead of decay. The black pool, once feared and avoided, was now just a still body of water, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky. Word quickly spread through the town that the curse had been broken. The people began to speak of Lydia, of her bravery and her sacrifice. She became a hero in their eyes, a symbol of hope and renewal. They knew that the swamp would always hold its mysteries and dangers, but the darkness that had haunted them was gone. Lydia had given them a chance to reclaim their lives, to move forward without the weight of the past. In the nearby town, the people stirred from their slumber, unaware of the events that had unfolded in the swamp. The fear that had gripped their hearts for so long had eased, though they couldn't yet explain why. The air seemed lighter, the sun warmer, as if a great burden had been lifted from the land. As the townsfolk went about their morning routines, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The whispers of the swamp witch and the Southern Cannibal were no longer spoken of with fear. Instead, there was a sense of relief, as if a long nightmare had finally ended. The oppressive silence that had settled over the town for generations had given way to a cautious optimism. Mr. Johnson, the elderly shopkeeper, stepped outside his store and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. He could feel it. Something had changed. The unease that had always gnawed at the back of his mind was gone, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what had happened, but he suspected that Lydia had something to do with it. The people of the town began to gather in the square, exchanging glances of wonder and confusion. They didn't understand how or why, but they knew that the swamp and their lives had been changed forever. The curse that had hung over them like a dark cloud was gone, and in its place was the promise of a new beginning. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, a few of the braver souls ventured out to the edge of the swamp, curious to see what had changed. They found the bayou quiet and serene, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers instead of decay. The black pool, once feared and avoided, was now just a still body of water, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky. Word quickly spread through the town that the curse had been broken. The people began to speak of Lydia, of her bravery and her sacrifice. She became a hero in their eyes, a symbol of hope and renewal. They knew that the swamp would always hold its mysteries and dangers, but the darkness that had haunted them was gone. Lydia had given them a chance to reclaim their lives, to move forward without the weight of the past. Are you craving more spine-chilling tales? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to never miss a new story. Join us for more terrifying journeys into the unknown, where suspense and horror lurk around every corner. And don't forget to share your thoughts and suggestions for our next video in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned if you dare.